The Communist Manifesto by Marx and Engels was written in 1848. It set forward a communist ideology that has grown synonymous with the term communism itself. But the reality of the matter is, there has always been two radically different visions of socio-economic philosophy, both of which are known as communism. The first kind of communism is based on true altruism, a willingness to think of others more highly than oneself, and a practice of the Golden Rule. The second kind of communism is a communism that subtracts God from the equation and seeks to find equality on its own self-made terms. This form of communism is self-serving and seeks to level the playing field through might equals right tyranny. It sells itself on the benevolent precepts of the first form of communism, but denies the obvious fact that man, left to his own devices, is greedy and self-serving, and without living for God, he can only live for himself. So why not get all that he can from this life? And if someone disagrees with you, eliminate him. So we see then in the competing visions that the elemental difference between the two forms of communism is that one is effected through force and the other is voluntary. Set in mid-19th century Paris, The Wandering Jew by Eugene Sue is an exceptional work of historical fiction, depicting with rarefied insight the methods employed by the Jesuits in their intricate system of espionage and subterfuge. It was originally published in 1844, the same year Karl Marx met Friedrich Engels, also in Paris. Knowing Marx to be educated and employed as an agent of the papists, it comes as no surprise to realize that the communism he espoused, the state-enforced communism that inevitably and invariably leads to despotism, was that which mirrored the Jesuit reductions throughout South America during the 17th and 18th centuries, wherein the indigenous peoples were kept as slaves in communes, with their economy under the direction of a central bank, the goods they produced being shipped back to the colonial powers under the auspices of world commerce and trade. Quote-unquote, free trade is nothing new, and the last thing it promotes is the freedom of the lower classes. The other kind of communism, what might now be referred to as libertarian socialism or voluntary communism, the type of communism of the first century church as depicted in the book of Acts, is something in direct opposition to the manipulative tyranny of Jesuitism, whereas modern communism would seem quite in line with it, especially when mixed with corporate fascism, as we see are the blended ingredients of the New World Order. It should come as no surprise then to see the Jesuit Pope from South America advancing the neo-communist agenda of his forebears. Excerpt from the abridged edition of The Wandering Jew, A Tale of the Jesuits, Chapter 27, Communism. The chapter begins with an account of how a certain Monsieur Hardy has built a business that stands in stark contrast to those in the surrounding area, and that his employees are well remunerated for their labor, and provided for with quality, inexpensive housing. This, along with the unwillingness of Hardy's employees to turn against their benefactor and join the neighboring workmen in what was essentially union action demanding a redress of grievances against the pitiless lords of commerce exploiting them, has drawn the ire of the workmen of the neighborhood who live in slums paying higher rent for lower wages. At the tavern, their passions are played upon by a Jesuit coadjutor who incites the mob to set off to burn and pillage Monsieur Hardy's factory and the living quarters of his employees. Quoting now from the book. Before, however, we go further in this description, which will probably seem somewhat imaginative, we assert that the wonders we are about to describe are no utopian dreams, but realities in which capital has been safely and profitably invested. To undertake so great and beneficial a scheme as that of providing a large number of human beings with comforts that seem ideal when contrasted with the frightful lot to which the poor are almost always condemned, to instruct them and elevate them in their own esteem, to cause them to prefer intellectual enjoyments to the degrading pleasures of the tavern, where they escape from the consciousness of their miserable destiny, to render them moral and happy by a generous undertaking which is easy of adoption. In short, to take a place among the benefactors of humanity and at the same time make a profitable employment of capital, would appear fabulous. Yet, this was the secret of the wonders to which we allude. One of the principal characters in the novel, a young man named Agricola, is then shown meeting his fiancée to show her about the premises of his employment and the living quarters they will soon share. He describes to her the success of his employer's factory and why he is so enthusiastic about his employment there. "Do you know, mademoiselle," said Agricola, "why I am so delighted with the gratifying task I am about to execute?" "I do not, Monsieur Agricola," replied Angele. "To show you this building and explain to you the resources of our association is to inform you that here a workman, assured of both the present and the future, is not, like a great number of his poor brethren, compelled to repress the dearest wish of his heart, the desire of choosing for himself a partner for life, fearful of increasing the misery of both. Here a workman may, without anxiety, indulge the hope of possessing family enjoyments, for he will not afterwards be annoyed with seeing those who are dependent upon him subjected to misery and privation. In short, to explain all this to you," added he with a smile, "is to prove to you that nothing can be more rational than to love, and nothing wiser than to marry." Agricola goes on to relate to his fiancée what he refers to as the secret of our prosperity. "Well, then, listen to me, mademoiselle. Monsieur Hardy, like a true magician, has pronounced those cabalistic words, association, community, fraternity. These words were understood by his workpeople, and the wonders which you see are created for our advantage, and also, I repeat, for that of Monsieur Hardy. Supposing, mademoiselle, that Monsieur Hardy, instead of being what he is, had been a heartless speculator, caring for nothing but his profits, saying to himself, 'In order that my factory may bring me large returns, what is required? Perfect workmanship, great economy in the use of the raw material, rigid employment of the workman's time, strict parsimony in order to produce cheapness and excellence in the products, that they may be sold dearly.' Well, mademoiselle, I will tell you how these things were attained. My workmen, in residing so far from the factory, will be compelled to rise earlier than they would otherwise do. Consequently, they will have less sleep than they require, and will not be so well able to work. Then again, the severity of the weather will render things worse. The workman will arrive wet, shivering with cold, and unfit to work. Therefore, what sort of work will he put off his hands? If, however, I provide lodgings for my workpeople near the factory, it will do away with these inconveniences. Let me estimate. A married man pays, in Paris, about 250 francs a year for 2 small and unhealthy apartments in some dark and filthy street, the hotbed of fever. What kind of work can be expected from people thus circumstanced? The unmarried men pay about 150 francs for apartments which are smaller, but equally unhealthy. Now I employ 146 married men who pay for their miserable dwellings about 36,500 francs a year, and I employ 115 young men who pay for theirs about 17,280 francs a year, making a total of upwards of 50,000 francs. To induce my men to leave their abodes in Paris, I must offer them great advantages. I must reduce their rents one half, and in place of unwholesome apartments, they must have them large and airy, and constructed so that they may be heated at little expense. The outlay required to construct buildings for my men will be 500,000 francs at the most, and the rents will bring in from 26,000 to 27,000, so that I shall have good interest for my money, which will be perfectly secure, for the rents will be paid out of the wages. Then again, as it is a well-known fact that men work better when they are well fed, I must persuade them to adopt the principle of association, which will enable them to purchase the necessities of life at half the price they are now paying to the petty dealer. Thus my men will be well fed and well lodged, will be more efficient workmen, which will be greatly to my advantage, independent of the 5% I shall receive for the outlay of my capital. Therefore you see, mademoiselle, that in a pecuniary point, without reckoning other and higher considerations, our employer, while contributing to the comfort and happiness of his workmen, would at the same time be reaping no small advantages to himself. A few words more, mademoiselle, and then you will understand as well as I do all the secrets of our association. We will still continue to take the same view of the intended speculator. He says to himself, "Here are my work people in the best condition possible for working well. Now a great deal of my success depends on the economical employment of the raw material. What shall I do to induce my workmen not to waste it? But this is not all. To obtain a good price for my products, they must be faultless in their manufacture. The men I employ work tolerably well, but I must have work that cannot be excelled. To accomplish these things I must give them an interest in the use of the material, and I must persuade them to try and discover the best modes of working, by making it their interest that everything that comes from their hands should be the most perfect of its kind. For a workman who has no interest in these matters says to himself, 'What need care I about them? I don't get any more pay.' But on the contrary, make it his interest to be zealous and industrious, and he redoubles his activity and stimulates everyone about him. What treasures of experience and practical knowledge are often lost for want of encouragement. This is a great pity, for a man engaged the whole of his life in a particular calling must discover 1,000 ways of doing things faster and better. I will establish a committee of consultation composed of my ablest workmen, and now that our interests are the same, vivid rays of light must necessarily be sent forth from this source of practical intelligence. The speculator is not deceived, for very soon, astonished at the incredible resources and ingenuity displayed by his workmen, he exclaimed, 'You are in possession of all these things without telling me of them. That which has cost me for 10 years past 100 francs to manufacture would have cost only 50, leaving out the immense saving of time.' 'Oh,' replied the workman, 'what did your gains signify to me?' 'Now it is different. I have, beside my wages, an interest in your success. You have raised me in my own esteem, and have consulted my knowledge and experience, and instead of treating me like an inferior, you have held communion with me. Therefore it is my interest as well as my duty to acquaint you with what I already know, and also to acquire still more. It seemed quite in the nature of things, then, that the Jesuits should desire a country of their own, where everything would be under their undivided and absolute control. In 1586 they found such a sphere and set to work in Paraguay, then a part, but many times larger than the present tiny republic, of the Spanish possessions in South America inhabited by the Guarani tribe of Indians. Within a score of years, the Jesuits had established 20-strong mission centers called reductions, with many thousands of the Guaranis enrolled as their members. Then they applied to the King of Spain for permission to constitute Paraguay a Christian republic in which no secular governor be allowed any control, so that a truly paradisiacal state of innocency be established. Under the king's suzerainty, to whom the Jesuits offered to pay an annual tribute of $1 for each adult member of the community. In 1608, the king, Philip III, acceded to this petition, and the Jesuit republic was set up. The general features of this state, which lasted till 1767, need not be elaborated here, save to say that each reduction was administered by 2 priests, a senior and a junior, with a rigid uniformity throughout everything, even the cities being so exactly alike that those sent to dispossess the Jesuits in 1767, arriving at one city after another, at first thought they had made a circuit and got back to the town they had just left, a fact showing that during the 158 years of their rule there, the Jesuits had thoroughly imposed the stamp of their order on the Guaranis. Certain other features of the case call for more particular notice. 1. The Jesuits aimed to set up there a completely communistic system in the sense that no individual rights were recognized and there was no private property. Everything belonged to the state and was supposed to be shared in common. But in reality, much the greater part of the proceeds of goods sold was always remitted to the Camarilla in Europe, and the Guaranis got only the bare necessities of life in return for their toil and sweat. 2. The money thus derived was truly enormous, says Bishop Palafox, even many hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. Writing of their revenues in the whole of South America about 1650, he declared their wealth had become so great that the secular clergy of the church will soon have to beg their bread from the Jesuits, who had seized all the sources of wealth. 3. By the charter empowering them to rule Paraguay and by their antecedent pledges, the Jesuits should have paid annual tribute to the king amounting to $1 per adult citizen. The highest sum ever paid was $40,000, though the adult population was probably never under 300,000. 4. There was one single point of connection between the Republic and the Spanish Empire in the person of the king, just as the Jesuit order connects with the Latin Church only in the person of the Roman Pontiff. The frailty of that connection stands disclosed in the matter of the tribute money. Indeed, so devoid of loyalty to Spain were the Jesuits that neither would they allow any Guarani to learn Spanish, nor would they tolerate any intercourse between the Guaranis and the peoples of the surrounding Spanish colonies, a prohibition maintained at the sword's point. 5. Within Paraguay, the Jesuits kept themselves as a caste completely apart from the Guaranis, even more so than the Druids from their people. In the whole 180 years of their stay there, no Guarani was ever prepared for and admitted to the priesthood, none ever promoted to be a teacher even. 6. Religious services were held mostly on saints' days, with sports and dances, which, as the Jesuits said, were accounted the best modes of condescending to the mental calibre of the Indians and of meeting their religious needs. 7. There is no evidence that any effort was ever made by the Jesuits to impart the truths, properly so called, of the Christian religion. Considering that so many of the Guaranis became so highly expert in the various handicrafts that the Jesuits could and did justly boast of their preeminent skill, it must be felt that these Indians had mental capacities of no mean order, which were never developed, nay more, which were even steadily repressed. 8. When then the Jesuits were expelled, the Guaranis, having had no moral or religious training to fit them to continue in the Christian faith, in a few years laid aside the rags and tatters of their religious observances and became as if no religious teachers had ever lived and worked among them. A vanished Arcadia, an irony or a satire according to our point of view. 9. Having throughout their tenure of Paraguay treated all their neighbors as scoundrels and pariahs, in 1767 the Jesuits had nowhere a friend to lift his voice or move a hand to succor them, but men everywhere rejoiced to see the day of their humiliation and discomfiture. The communism of the Paraguay experiment is indeed the true prototype of the many political ventures which since the French Revolution, but much more especially since the Great War of 1914 through 1918, have been taking shape in so many parts of the world wheresoever the vanguard of Rome has been strong enough and long enough at work under the surface of things to give body and life to the program of the Jesuit Camarilla. Karl Marx, the father of modern communism, was himself an occultist and high-level Jewish Freemason, intimately associated with Rome's Giuseppe Mazzini, the most powerful Shriner on the continent and the founder of the Mafia, and Albert Pike, the most powerful Shriner in 14th Amendment America, and a leader of the first Ku Klux Klan. He was privately tutored by Jesuits in the huge reading room of the British Museum while writing the Communist Manifesto based upon the 10 maxims or planks the order had perfected on its Paraguayan reductions and its Maryland reductions. His writings, including the Jewish Question in promoting the company's European Jewish Question agitation, Marx claiming, "Behind every tyrant stands a Jew, as a Jesuit stands behind every pope," and exhorting the workers of the world to fight and eliminate such a cancer, were financed by the society's wealthy, white, Gentile, cartel capitalists such as John D. Rockefeller Jr. and J.P. Morgan, also 33rd degree Freemasons, who, being in their doctrines and deeds, were in fact the revived old order of the crusading Papal Knights Templars. Brought to international fame in 1870 via the order's Paris Commune, Marx, a racial Jew, was chosen for this task, the order intending to blame all the brutal and savage evils of their absolutist, communist inquisition on the Semitic, Hebrew, Israelitic, Jewish race. This masterstroke of Jesuit genius was fulfilled by the Black Pope's Third Reich with its invasion of Russia during Operation Barbarossa, followed by the order's SS extirpation of infidel European and Russian Jewry with the aid of Stalin, Churchill, and FDR, pursuant to the bigoted and accursing Council of Trent.